statistics that came out over the last 5 years about the low knowledge of the American people about Iraq and 9/11. You know, on the eve of the Iraq War, only 1/3 of the American people understood that most of the world opposed our invasion. Another third thought the rest of the world was cheering us on because of all of Bush's talk about the Grand Coalition. And another third thought, oh, it was kind of mixed out there. They didn't apparently get a clue about how the largest rallies in history were organized in Spain, in Britain, and in other places against this war. Now, how can you have a democracy that way? It's very, very difficult. We've got to come to terms with this. That's why I say it's a 10-alarm fire.
When you say, how can you have a democracy? Are you really saying, are you going back to your conservative Burkean tradition and saying the people no, not the people yes?
Yeah.
What are you saying?
Well,
because
I'm saying,
you take this instrument, this beady red eye that's looking at us now, and you've said in a number of places that it's largely responsible because in a sense it's a surrogate for the people. You don't like the idea of cultural democracy. You don't, and I don't either, but you're sort of reverting to that conservatism that you identified as your younger with
when
years.
I started out, well, I opposed the Iraq War. I didn't like the Bush administration. I didn't vote for George Bush, so I don't think I'm going back to being a conservative. But there were things that I picked up for my years as a conservative. And maybe that has stuck with me. I don't believe the voice of the people is the voice of God. And I do think that we have to have an open conversation about the limits of the public. And what could actually be more democratic than that? Democracy is all about having a conversation, getting it out there, no taboo subjects. Let's talk about it. So let's talk about it. But this is the last taboo. You know, we can talk about the shape and size of the president's penis, but we can't talk about the weaknesses in public opinion. I mean, there's a paradox. And let's talk about another paradox in American history. Over the last half century, Americans have become smarter and smarter, at least in terms of schooling. In 1940, 6 out of 10 Americans hadn't gone past the 8th grade. Today, most Americans have gone to college. And yet, during this same period that Americans are getting more and more schooling, our politics are getting dumber and dumber. We need to explain that paradox. We need to be talking about it. Now, that's democracy, to talk about that.
And your explanation has to do with the schools and what goes on inside of them, or with the media and the way it contradicts, in a very real sense, with its emphasis upon entertainment, essentially, rather than information.
Yeah, well,
where are you in this?
Well, it's a very complicated series of forces that led us to this situation. And it begins with the schools not teaching civics and not placing an emphasis on civics and not placing an emphasis on history. And certainly over the last 8 years with the No Child Left Behind Act, which leaves behind history, doesn't test for history, so teachers have stopped teaching history, so the generation coming up is even dumber. And then we go to broader forces in the society, and we've got television, which just upends our politics. First of all, it helps destroy the two-party system. Once television gets into the act, it's the people who run television, it's consultants, it's TV directors, news directors, who wind up running politics as opposed to party bosses. And people used to take their cues from party bosses. The much reviled party bosses like Daley in Chicago, they would send a signal down the ranks, down the line to the people who were voting, and people were getting their cues. So even if they weren't all that knowledgeable about the issues, they were taking their cues from party bosses, from labor bosses, and of course the decline of labor unions plays into this. So it's a complicated mosaic. But if I had to pick one thing, it's this box. It's this box with wires. And I've been in television for years. I've been in and out of academia, and when I'm out of it, I've been in the television business. And you know, there's nothing more shallow than broadcast corporate television. And it's shallow for a reason, because the people who are watching the television sets don't have much knowledge. And so there's a constant emphasis to talk about something that is not going to go over the heads of the audience. So instead of having a conversation up here, the conversation is always down here. When I was helping run a local news station, the CBS affiliate in Seattle, KIRO-TV, we did $1 million study when I first came in to figure out, what does the audience want? What are they interested in? Politics was last on their list, dead last. First and foremost was weather. They loved weather. They wanted to know about the weather. They wanted to know about traffic. They wanted to know about sports. They wanted to know about earthquakes in Seattle, because we have the threat of earthquakes there. But politics, forget it. So as a managing editor, which was my position, every night when I'm trying to program for my newscast, I insisted that we have politics, because just as a matter of good conscience, I could not have politics. But often you're leading with Keiko the whale. Now, I have to tell you, I had to finally get out of the business because I just couldn't bear it anymore. I couldn't bear it.
Then why do you think, and I gather from your book and from other things you've said and written and from what you do with your History News Network, I gather you're hopeful. How can you be hopeful? You're describing the nature of human nature. Yeah. And we respond to it. We reflect it.
Sure. Well, one, by nature, I'm an optimist. So
I thought you were a conservative.
I'm a liberal, but I had my origins in my conservative days. But no, I'm an optimist. And I do think that there are steps that we can take as a society if we commit to it. What we need is kind of a Sputnik civics program nationwide. If here's a good concrete example of what I think we could do that would really change things for the next generation. Every college and university in America that receives public funding ought to require freshman students to take a current events quiz every single week for their first year.
You mean read the newspaper?
Actually, read the newspaper. I was teaching graduate school at a university in Washington, D.C. In journalism. And I had graduate students in journalism who weren't reading the paper. And it was obvious when one day in the 1990s, 3 weeks after Denny Hastert had become the Speaker of the House, I just asked the class, because I was talking about him, and I realized they were kind of like giving me blank stares. I said, well, who is the Speaker of the House? And it was dead silence. And then one kid, raised his hand and he said, Hastert? And he was, really unsure. And I was like, yes. I said, Denny Hastert. Well, it was at that point I said, okay, you are journalism students. You're going into the business presumably because you love journalism. You're going to be writing stories. That's what we're teaching in this class, is how to write news stories. And what's happening here? You're not reading. I said, who do you think is going to read all the stuff that you're going to write if you're not reading it? So I said, that's it. We're going to start having weekly quizzes. Well, by the end of the term, they were reading the New York Times. They were reading the Washington Post. They were much better educated. And I felt like I've done something. Why can't we do that in every college and university? It would have an enormous impact. And if the society communicates the idea that it's not just money that is important, but civics is important, I think you could change the society.
Now, when you go to the Stewart Show, the Jon Stewart Show, are you going to say that? Are you going to say, hey, I can't stand it that I or a guy by the name of Heffner ask his students where do they get their news about the world around them, and they say from Jon Stewart?
I'm happy that they pick up some information from whatever source they can, as long as it's halfway reliable. The Stewart Show is actually fairly credible. Of course, as he always says, it's a fake news show, and he says he's shocked that people are using his show as a source of information, and that is shocking. College students in particular, it's a gift. Education is a gift. You're not making the most of your gift if you are getting your information from the Jon Stewart Show rather than from the morning newspaper. I mean, to me, reading the New York Times every day is almost an act of religion. I have to do it. I've been doing it since the 7th or 8th grade when I grew up in Hohokus, New Jersey, and they had us kids get subscriptions to the New York Times at a discount to get us into the newspaper reading habit. And to me, you know, if you're a kid and you're going to college and you're paying thousands of dollars per course, think of it this way. The New York Times every morning is like a high-level seminar in American politics, and it's free. You can go on the internet and it's free. And I think the digital divide is collapsing. Most people have access to the internet. Do yourself a favor. Spend 5 minutes. I take maybe sometimes up to 2 hours to get through the paper. There's so much in there. Okay, a student, you've got a lot to do. Fine. Take 5 minutes. Find one meaty story on the front page. Read it all the way through to the end. Dip into the op-eds. And over 6 months, you'll start to get that knowledge so that the political conversation isn't taking place above your head.